Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Kristina Cooper today. She has a very unique background that I find unique, at least. She was an English and history major at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where she got her degrees there, and she also concentrated in elementary education. But what she went into, she worked for the IRB at the University of Colorado, Denver for 7 years before coming to Carilion Clinic. And she came to Carilion Clinic as the senior compliance specialist back in 2016. And I've had the pleasure of having her now on our team as our clinical research regulatory manager. So Kristina, look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for coming today. Again, I'm Kristina Cooper. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager in our Research and Development Department, but I'm also the Carilion Clinic PRS Administrator. So that is the Protocol Registration and Results System within ClinicalTrials.gov. So today we're going to talk a little bit about navigating ClinicalTrials.gov. It is a necessary and important website, but it has its issues and problems and frustrations. So hopefully we can help solve those this hour. Okay, so our agendas for today will be going over a brief overview of ClinicalTrials.gov, the website and database itself, for those of you that are less familiar or haven't had to input your own records within the website. We will talk about what is considered an applicable clinical trial or an ACT versus those that are non, but still require submission. We will also then talk about voluntary submissions. So if you decide to submit your record onto the website, what are the pros and cons of doing so? We will also go over registration, how-to, and guidance. There is a lot of information on the website itself, so we won't go too in depth for that. But just a little bit of hints and tricks for you. We will also talk about maintenance and results reporting, and then the fun of violations and penalties if we don't get those taken care of correctly. So to start off, we'll talk about what exactly is ClinicalTrials.gov. So ClinicalTrials.gov is a website and a database that is through the National Library of Medicine, which is an institute within the NIH. The purpose of ClinicalTrials.gov is to provide information about clinical research studies to the public, researchers, and healthcare professionals. A limited review of the information that's put on the website is done by the National Library of Medicine. However, the NIH and other US government agencies do not review or approve the safety or the scientific merit of all the studies that are on there. Instead, they rely on sponsors or investigators to include up-to-date information about the studies that they are conducting and including results of those studies regardless of the outcome. As of July 2023, so this month, the database includes over 450,000 studies, and they take place in all 50 states and over 200 countries. I believe they're at 221 at last check. And finally, ClinicalTrials.gov provides sponsors and investigators a place to publicly share information about clinical trials and the results of those trials in a way that supports laws, regulations, and policies requiring them to do so. So a little history of the major milestones that have taken place within ClinicalTrials.gov. So this initially began back in 1997 when Congress required that the NIH create a database of clinical trials that were under an investigational new drug application, or an IND, so test investigational drugs that were for serious and life-threatening diseases. The FDA and NIH got together to create the website, and it was launched to the public for the first time back in 2000. Now, that only included those that were under an IND, so there wasn't a whole lot of studies that were on there. So to kind of booster enrollment, the medical journal editors, including the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, began to require that anytime you wanted to publish your trial with a medical journal, you were required to submit it onto ClinicalTrials.gov or a similar database. A year later, the World Health Organization created a similar policy saying that all research, regardless of where it was, not only those in the US, should have their clinical trials on a public database. There are a few different ones in Europe and other places, but ClinicalTrials.gov, again, over 200 countries utilize it. So it is primarily the distinct public database. So 10 years after its inception came FDA, or the FDA Amendments Act of 2007. And this expanded the information that sponsors and investigators had to include on ClinicalTrials.gov, including different types of trials. So instead of just an IND, it had investigational device exemptions, or IDEs, also biologics, and FDA regulated trials. It also started to have results have to be required. So for the first 10 years, it was basically a database. It was kind of a Google search of clinical trials that were taking place. And then after that, they decided it would be great if some people could see what the results are, that they could see additional information, including safety. So in 2008, the database was launched for the public for the first time. And that included that information, again, on who was actually participating in these trials, and then if there was any additional information, including safety and outcomes. Then another 10 years later, so I'm a little scared what's going to happen in 2027. It seems like every 10 years they have a big overhaul. So in 2017, the Department of Health and Human Services final rule applied, and this further explained what consequences occur if you do not submit according to FDA, and when you need to report your results, and exactly what trials need to be in there. That same year, the NIH made a policy that any study that they wholly or partly fund must be registered on ClinicalTrials.gov. And then finally, then 2018, with the revised common rule, when it finally went into effect, they required sponsors, investigators of government-funded studies to post a consent form to ClinicalTrials.gov or regulations.gov. I'd actually never heard of regulations, and I looked, they're on ClinicalTrials.gov. I'm not entirely sure what exactly is on regulations. Okay, so what exactly are applicable clinical trials, or ACTs? These are the studies that are mandated under that FDAMA, which was that 1997 rule, or FDA, which was the 2007. There are 4 questions that need to be answered yes in order for it to be an applicable clinical trial. The first is the study interventional? So if there's one or more interventions taking place for research purposes only, then the answer to this would be yes. So if you were doing an observational, you were recording, say, like a retrospective or a chart review, some clinical information that you're going to utilize for your research study, that would not constitute an intervention. And so this would be no. Then question 2 is a bit of a subpart. So it doesn't have to be all 3 of these questions, but it has to be at least one. So the first one is at least one study facility located in the US or a US territory, such as Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands. Then is the study conducted under an investigational new drug application, an IND, or an investigational device exemption, an IDE? Or does the study involve a drug, biological, or device product that is manufactured in and exported from the US or a US territory for study in another country? So even if we're not utilizing the product within the US, if we are going to invent something with our innovation team here at Carillion and then ship it to Canada, and they're going to do the study, then the answer to this would be yes, because it was manufactured here. The third question is more basically, is it FDA regulated? So if it has at least one drug, biological, or device product that's regulated by the FDA, then the answer to this would be yes. So in the previous rules, it was the INDs or IDEs. So it's basically your investigational products. And now they require anything that's FDA regulated. So that would include anything that is already FDA approved, such as over the counter. If you're utilizing it within a research study, it needs to be registered. And then finally, 4 is a little bit of a tricky question because it's a bit of a negative. It's anything that is other than. So other than a phase 1 trial of a drug or biological product, so that would be first in humans, or is a study other than a device feasibility study. So if you're just trying to see if your device works, but not looking for any treating or mitigating a condition or disease, or the actual effects of the device, then the answer to this would be yes, if you don't have one of those studies. So again, that one gets a little bit tricky. But you have to answer yes to all 4 questions. And if the study was initiated on or after January 18th of 2017, when the final rule applied, then the trial would be considered an applicable clinical trial and need to be registered under 42 CFR 11. Now, if you don't have one of those and you think, great, I'm off the hook, there are additional clinical trial definitions. These are studies that are non-ACTs, but they still require registration based on their the specifics of each institution or each organization. So first, the ICMJE. So remember, they were asking for any study to be included. So the way that they differ from the ACTs is that ACTs are primarily going to be your FDA regulated. However, ICMJEs require anything that is including drugs and devices, but also behavioral treatments, educational programs, dietary interventions, quality improvement interventions, and process of care changes. So anything that you are anticipating that is going to be published needs to be registered according to the ICMJE. Now, the NIH, they differ from your ACTs in that they also have include anything that is wholly or partially funded by them, but they include phase 1 clinical trials. So remember, the ACTs, it doesn't have to be, they don't include phase 1s, but NIH does if they provide funding, and they also will include behavioral interventions or those that are not FDA regulated. And this rule applied back in January 2017. So a little bit further into the timeline of record creation, when exactly you have to do it and where and who and why and what. So we'll start off with what. So again, interventional clinical trials primarily need to be registered for all of the options. So if you are going to have an applicable clinical trial or a non-applicable, but it meets one of those other criteria, such as you're going to publish results or it's funded by the NIH, that needs to be included. Observational clinical trials, they are not considered applicable clinical trials except for some rare, if you have pediatric post-market surveillance of a product, of a device. Those can be considered applicable clinical trials, but for the most part, observational are going to not be. But if you are going to publish your results or you have NIH funding, you would have to register them. And then expanded access. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with what expanded access is, it's typically when you have a investigational product that could benefit a patient that would otherwise not be able to obtain that product on a clinical trial. So maybe they don't meet the inclusion/exclusion criteria. So the sponsor or the manufacturer of the investigational product will have to submit a request to the FDA in order for that patient to be able to use that investigational product outside of a clinical trial. We do have a few of them here. They do run similar to a research study in that they need IRB approval and additional regulations, but we can talk about that if you come across one in your work. So who is the responsible party? Who needs to register it? So for the majority of studies, it's going to be the sponsor. And the sponsor is defined in several different ways, but primarily it's going to be the IND or the IDE holder. The principal investigator can occasionally be part of a responsible party for an applicable clinical trial. It's a lot of work and responsibility, so they have to meet several requirements. including be responsible for conducting the study. They have to have access and control over all the data, the right to publish the results of the data, and they have to meet some additional criteria. So a sponsor can designate it, but I don't recommend you volunteer yourself if the sponsor can be the responsible party. If you are the principal investigator and you are the holder of the IND or an IDE, then you would be considered the sponsor investigator and you would be the responsible party. So when do you have to submit these? So if it's an applicable clinical trial, it needs to be on ClinicalTrials.gov within 21 days of enrollment of your first participant. Now, the ICMJE and other medical journals don't give you that leeway. They're a little bit more stringent. They actually want it prior to enrollment of your first participant. So you can't retrospectively and put your record on there. It has to be before you really start your study. So you are able to create your record and have your record published prior to enrollment. You would just have to make some changes to it, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But where do you go to do this? So the protocol registration and results system, or PRS, is under register.clinicaltrials.gov. So clinicaltrials.gov is the public website. The PRS system is where you're going to input that information, and that is not shared with the public. It is between the organization and the PRS administrators. So why do we have to do all this? So I like to say with any kind of regulations, there are valid reasons why. It's not the joy of regulatory people, despite what you might think, to make all sorts of rules and requirements to just frustrate you and make your life more difficult. It really is helpful, and it is partly due to the fact that this gives trial transparency, both on a financial end and an ethical. So a lot of funding goes into research, and how many times do you actually get to see where that money is going, who is doing the research, and what are the results of that? So this helps with that, to make sure that people are able to see what is going on. It also helps avoid duplication of efforts. So you may think you have a great, bright idea that nobody else has thought of in the entire world. Get on clinicaltrials.gov and do a search and see. And maybe there is somebody who has got a similar idea that you could collaborate with, or maybe they have thought of something that you had not thought of in your attempt. And that can lead to collaboration, or it can also, of course, anytime you collaborate, it leads to an advancement in science. And then there's the ethical principle of it. So again, we would like to be as transparent as possible. Participants are providing their data, their samples, their lives to you. So it is really important that they are able to see not only the results of that, but if there's something that they have a disease or a condition that they feel alone and they feel like there's nobody in their area that is doing research on it, maybe there is somebody someplace that is doing it that could help out. So it is a pain, but it is important. So this could be a little bit of an interaction if you would like. So I cannot see the chat, so somebody's gonna have to help me. But we can go a little bit over what you think if you want to utilize the chat for drug clinical trials under an IND. Is this considered an applicable clinical trial?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, good. It is. All right. Who would be considered the responsible party? Who is going to have to create the record?
Also, feel free to unmute if you want to just say your response. Somebody that's sponsor.
That is correct. So it would be the IND holder is going to be the responsible party. And then when does this need to be registered by? So this is going to be that 21 days after the first enrollment. And then finally, do results have to be reported?
Yes.
Yes, yes, they do. Good job. All right, so this one's a little bit trickier. Behavioral intervention with no drug or device. Is this considered an applicable clinical trial?
No, yes.
Yes.
A little indecisive here.
Okay, so this is going to be no, it doesn't meet that criteria. Again, applicable clinical trials are primarily going to be your FDA regulated. So it's going to have a drug or a device or a biological product within it.
Okay.
But maybe you're going to publish it. So you do need to register it. It's just not going to be considered, it's going to be one of those non-ACTs. So who's going to have to register it? This is one that can be a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
The responsible party is likely going to be the PI. So unless you have a foundation, now this is tricky for a lot of people. I'm part of a task force that includes Harvard, Stanford, Yale, I think over 100 different organizations. And we just had an email conversation yesterday about a study that is an applicable clinical trial and who needs to report it. Is it the organization that it's the university that was being used under, or was it the grant holder? And it was mixed on them. So likely, depending on your institution's policies, who is going to be involved. But again, if it's the voluntary submission, it's likely going to be the PI. And then when does this need to be registered by? Again, it's kind of a tricky. So if you're going to publish, it'd have to be that prior to the first participant. If it's a voluntary submission, it won't have those same regulations and requirements, but you would like to, it won't have any penalties if you don't meet that criteria, if you're not going to publish and it's just a voluntary submission, but you do want to have it published prior to or as close as possible to your first participant. And then finally for this one, do results have to be reported? I know I don't give you a lot of information. So it doesn't meet the criteria for under FDA that you have to report it, but it may fall under other requirements, and it's always best practice if you have results. Now, if you're going to publish it, they're likely going to ask you for some results. So that could be definitely a yes, but it doesn't meet that criteria under the regulations. Okay, last one, and we'll try to breeze through these a little bit. Phase 1 drug trials funded by NIH. Is this an applicable clinical trial?
Yes.
It actually isn't. So again, remember applicable clinical trials, that's that question number 4. So it's the other than. So if it's an applicable clinical trial, it's not going to be a phase 1. Anything other than a phase 1 that's a drug trial will be an applicable clinical trial, but phase 1s are not. However, the NIH requires, if they are providing funding, they want results or registration regardless of the phase. So they do include phase 1s. So I'm sorry I tricked you guys. And then who would be the responsible party? This is another tricky one. I may just go with it. This could be any options. So just dependent, again, if you have a sponsor, an industry, a pharmaceutical is going to be providing the drug for you, likely they are going to be the responsible party because in future they may want to get FDA approval. If you are the holder of that or you're the one that has created the drug, then you would be the sponsor investigator. Unlikely to be the PI, but it would be, you would be considered sponsor investigator if you were the PI with that drug. And then registration is going to be similar, and I don't think I put it in the timeline, so I will give you the answer for that because that would be cheating. NIH follows the same as FDA as far as when do you need to have it registered by, and it is 21 days after the first enrollment. And then do results have to be reported? And the answer is similar. Yes, they do follow, again, same as FDA, so they would ask for it.
So we have a question and or statement here from Dr. Farrell. Kristina, it is more important to know when it needs to be registered rather than ACT?
Stating that. So it is important as far as your the applicable clinical trials are going to be your regulations are going to be under there. So those non-ACTs, or say the ICMJE, so you're planning on publishing, you won't be able to publish if you do it. So that the timing is important, that you haven't got it published after you've enrolled 20 participants. So that way the timing is important. ACT is going to have that issue for the 21 days. They will look at it, and when we talk about penalties, those fall under those civil monetary penalties are under the ACTs. So it is important to know which are applicable clinical trials and which are not.
Right.
So, yeah, so all important, but yeah, again, confusing. So we will hopefully help you figure it out. So how will you know exactly here? Are there any guidelines that can help you within Carilion Clinic? So if you're utilizing Carilion Clinic as your IRB, this will be included on your IRB outcome letter. So it'll look like this. It will ask you to register it again before your they have enrollment for the first participant, but it really is that 21 days for some studies. And then you could research at CarilionClinic.org. That will get to me, and you can reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end of the slide if you need help with registration. Again, if you're doing a multi-site industry sponsored, it only has to be registered once, and it has to be the responsible party that registers it. So the majority of the time, if you're doing an industry sponsored clinical trial, it's going to be the sponsor, so your investigational product holder. If you are looking now, the Carilion Clinic IRB will ask regardless of which IRB you use. So if you're utilizing them, or you're using a central IRB such as WCG or Advara, they will ask you about your NCT number. That's the number which is on ClinicalTrials.gov. That is for each study specifically. You can get on ClinicalTrials.gov. Unless we are the very first site, it's likely to already be on there, and you can just include that information. So when you get on ClinicalTrials.gov, it puts up this search space, and then you can look up through protocol name, condition. I know a lot of protocols use acronyms, but they sometimes duplicate acronyms. So sometimes having a second keyword is helpful. And then the sponsor, and usually you can find it fairly easily that way. All right, so if you don't meet the applicable clinical trial or a non-applicable clinical trial that has requirements such as the NIH, or you're going to publish results, if it doesn't meet any of those criteria and you still want to voluntarily submit it, we'll talk a little bit briefly about that. So again, we've talked about phase ones do not need to submit. Same with small clinical trials for feasibility of a device product, trials that don't include a drug, biological, or device, and then non-interventional observational clinical research such as cohort studies typically do not need to be in there. However, if you decide that you still want to, for whichever reason, you need to be made aware that although it won't meet those civil penalties, it won't meet the registration non-compliance, you still are responsible for keeping it up to date. Once you put something in the database, it's in there. So you can't just change your mind later and try to delete. Doesn't happen. So once you've committed, you have to really truly be committed and be a responsible party. And another reason for this is trigger trials. So if you do a voluntary submission that didn't meet the criteria for applicable clinical trial, but you submitted it anyway, and it did great, and then you go to the FDA and you're under one of these different sections. So 351 is biologicals, 505 is new drugs, 510K or 515, those are going to be your device, usually pre-markets. And then 520M is if you have a HD or humanitarian device exemption. So if you're trying to get licensure or approval or clearance for that drug or device that you have voluntarily submitted, using your voluntary submission, it's going to trigger likely a request for an applicable clinical trial. And the reason for this is that they just want it, again, they don't do the safety or the scientific merit of your studies. So they just do a very limited review when you submit it. They rely on you to provide that information. So to make sure that there's not just positive results listed, that if it were to advance to an applicable clinical trial, that there may be negative or uncertain results of that same product, they just want to make sure that that doesn't occur. So just be aware, again, you will never hear somebody say that, a regulatory person say, don't give us more information or don't include everything that is possible. But just be aware that if you are going to take on that responsibility, it is a pretty big responsibility. So just to be careful with that. Again, I agreed with this statement. So I'm not trying to scare anybody or discourage anybody from doing it. I know we have a lot of our collaborations with medical students, and they sometimes request that they're on there. We can work with them, but we also need to work with the PI to make sure that once that medical student is gone, that record is still going to be safe and kept up to date.
Somebody else mentioned, I am not following what constitutes a triggered trial or the related discussion.
Gotcha. So triggered trials are, so if you voluntarily submit, so if you have a study that doesn't meet the criteria of it must be registered. So we're going to use the applicable clinical trial. So it doesn't meet the criteria for perhaps maybe it was a product that is a dietary supplement, right? Those are not FDA regulated. So it's not going to be considered an applicable clinical trial, but you want to use it, or you want to submit your study of that dietary supplement on ClinicalTrials.gov. So it doesn't need to be registered. It's not required to. You submit it anyway. Then you have great results. Whatever your objective was or your outcome measure, you met it. So you're excited. You decide that then you want to submit to the FDA for approval or clearance to use it as an FDA regulated product, right? So again, they don't normally do dietary supplements. They will do it if you try to do it as a diagnosed, treat, or condition, a condition or disease. So if you're trying to mitigate something and use it outside of its normal course, then it could trigger the requirement to do an applicable clinical trial before you get that approval. So it's just to say, if you're going to do a voluntary submission, you may have to then do an applicable clinical trial that does have to be registered, that does have to go through the full clinical trial process in order.
So I've unmuted myself. So this is Paul Skolnick. I'm the questioner. Wouldn't you have to, so I understand everything, but to get FDA approval, wouldn't you have to do all those submissions anyway at that point, whether or not you've done this voluntary submission? Or else what I'm not getting is the extra work that you alluded to.
Gotcha. It's just so the extra work would be if you try to skip that. So in other words, you were trying to get your product listed on a website, advertised, say you don't go for an FDA regulation, right? Or an FDA approval, but you voluntarily submit your study, you provide results, you publish it as if it has been, it's on ClinicalTrials.gov, it's a registered clinical trial. It's just going to maybe trigger additional trials that are going to be then considered applicable clinical trials that have to be registered.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I can provide you additional information. I don't believe I put additional information on the trigger trials, but I can send you some documents for that and checklists. So basically, the voluntary submission, I just want to make clear, is the importance of it is that you can't just voluntarily submit it and then forget about it, because it will sit within Carillion's organizational, and then that could trigger some additional scrutiny on our other actual applicable clinical trials. So that is another warning, I guess, or issue that could come up with voluntary submissions. So again, I'm never going to say don't submit it, but I think a lot of people will sometimes do it and think it's not, it's just kind of easy breezy, and it takes a lot of work. So the PRS administrators believe that at least your initial submission takes likely 8 hours to complete. And then you're over the lifetime of the study, you're reporting your results and things, it's at 40 hours. So if you don't have to submit it and you don't have the time or the commitment to do it, I'm just saying, we maybe have a conversation with me before you move forward. Okay, so if you do have to submit, or you voluntarily decide you're going to be committed to being the responsible party, how do you register? So again, that's going to be on the register, ClinicalTrials.gov. Each organization has an account. Carilion Clinics is Carilion Clinic, no space in between. Usernames are typically going to be your Active Directory name, or which something similar to that as far as your emails go. So we have some of our BTC SOM students on there, and some of theirs are different. But as the PRS administrator for Carilion Clinic, I will help create your user account. And that information will be sent to you with a temporary password. I won't go through this exactly. This is on the PRS. When you go onto the registry, they give you a quick start guide to help you out. First thing they're going to ask you to do is change your password and then create a record. So again, the record within, it doesn't have to be done in one day. So that is good, because again, it is fairly lengthy. It asks a lot of different information, which will be on the next slide. And they have some strict language preferences, grammatical things, which as an English major, I appreciate, but can be a little bit frustrating if you're trying to just copy and paste from your PRISM application, for example. There's going to be some things that you're going to have to change to apply to the ClinicalTrials.gov requirements. Once you do get through all of the different stages of data, then you would mark it as entry complete. Then the PRS administrator for your organization, for Carilion Clinic, it is me, will receive information that your study is completed and can approve and release the record, unless you are the designated investigator and responsible party. So if you're the sponsor investigator, or this is one of those voluntary submissions that is solely reliant on you, I can help you. I can review and approve it, but the release of the record to the PRS administrator is going to be the responsible party's responsibility. So you may have to do that yourself. Then the record, PRS will review it. They are pretty quick about it. They may come back with some clarifications or requirements. But then once they do that and everything looks good, they will publish it to ClinicalTrials.gov website within 2 to 5 business days. And that's when you're going to receive the NCT number that may be a requirement for your funding source or for the IRB. If you need to modify the record, you can do that anytime with modify the record, except for if the PRS are reviewing it, it will be locked. So they do double ask you if you are sure that you want to submit to them for review. If you made a mistake or you realize something afterwards, you will just have to go through the same steps of approving and re-releasing it for them to review. And then you can always make changes, and we'll have when you need to do those coming up. And then keep your records up to date, pay special attention to recruitment statuses. Those have deadlines as far as if you are a common rule, under a common rule. So you have federal funding and you meet that criteria for that informed consent form. Your informed consent has to be uploaded onto ClinicalTrials.gov by a certain date of when your last participant finished their last data collection or their last intervention. So that's why the recruitment statuses and when those change is important to pay attention to. Same with contact information. So again, if you have your coordinator or research assistant or medical student or fellow as a contact, that's perfectly acceptable. But if they move on, you want to make sure that they're correct, that's updated so that people can reach you when needed. And then of course, always check for problems. And they do, I think it's pretty much a quarterly, you may receive a PRS administrator email from them if there are any issues with your study. Primarily, it's going to be if it's not been updated in a while, which we will go over shortly. So here's just a little bit of the information that is on the website that is required for you to register your study. Of course, they talk about study description and study design, conditions and keywords that people can look up to make sure if there's a specific condition that they want to get information on. Arms, groups, and interventions. Now, this is where a lot of the things will get pushed back. If you have different arms or interventions, but you don't provide this, you don't spell out exactly the outcome measures for each of those, even if they are utilizing similar processes, maybe the same questionnaire, but one's going to be slightly different timing. You have to provide that information for each intervention or each arm. And they are also very specific on things like if you say you're going to use a questionnaire, they want to know exactly what that questionnaire is. If you're using a pain scale, you can't just say you're using a pain scale or a visual analog scale. You have to say if it's a scale from 1 to 10, you have to say, is 1 the worst or is 10 the worst? You have to be that descriptive on that. Same with eligibility. You don't have to put your whole inclusion exclusion criteria, but kind of a pre-screening what will weed out those that will definitely not be applicable for your trial, but just enough that information that people can find it if they want to get more information. And then same with locations and site contact information. Again, you want to make sure that the updated contact is available. They'll ask about sponsors and collaborating sites. So again, every study has to be registered once. So the majority of your industry sponsored trials have already been registered by your sponsor, your IND holder. So they will just be adding Carilion Clinic as a site. And then there is an option for IPD sharing statement. So if you have intellectual property that you cannot disclose or do not want to disclose, there is a section for that and justification for why that's not going to be shared. And then your references. So anything that you referenced, previous studies, for example, that you use to create your protocol, you would put those on there. I don't believe those go onto the public record, but they are a part of your PRS record. So here's just an example of what is currently on ClinicalTrials.gov for Carilion Clinic. Now, ClinicalTrials.gov is going through a modernization. So they have had since the 2000, pretty much the same website until last month. So they've been working on this modernization to make it a little more user-friendly, mobile access, things like that. So they are kind of in a hybrid right now. You can get that onto the classic site. That's going to be retired and archived likely next year. Or you can use the modern site. So they claim that everything that's on the classic is on the modern, but the task force has been finding some discrepancies, and I did as well. So stay tuned to make sure those are all on there. But as you can see, the majority of our studies are going to be those interventional. We do have some observational, so those may be our voluntary submissions or patient registries that are included on there. We have those 3 expanded access options, and then study status is something you can look at as well. So we do have one that looks like it's not yet recruiting, so they have not enrolled anybody, but they are got a head start, good for them. So they are on the website, but they have not enrolled anybody. Then recruiting, we have 63. And then if you're no longer looking, but again, it stays on there forever. So anybody that's in follow-up would be on those active not recruitings. Completed is they actually completed the study. Hopefully those all should have results. And then the terminated is we have had an uptick in those thanks to COVID. So that's been something that has come across every institution. It appears that they started and then anticipated that they would be able to complete their trials, and then either the funding was gone or the participants were gone. So it will be terminated. You have to still try to provide as many results as you can in those cases, but if there is no results, terminated is also if you have enrolled at least one. So the withdrawn is if you have had your record on there, it'll stay on there, but the withdrawn is if you had nobody enrolled. And then finally, the funder types. So our NIH is likely a good chunk of those would be anything that we have a collaborating with, a site that has NIH funding, as well as our oncology studies are going to be under NIH funding. Other US federal agencies, I know we have at least one Department of Defense clinical trial currently, but there may be other departments that are providing funding for us. And then again, most of them are going to be industry, and then the all others would be, some of those might be our voluntary submissions, other ones would be collaborations or organizations. So if Krilling Clinic RAP grant, for example, that would be considered a funding type under the others. So when do you need to update your records? So if there are changes made, they have to be done within 30 days of that change. They have to be updated on ClinicalTrials.gov. So this would include any of your protocol amendments or change in contact information or a change in that status of recruitment or enrollment. Also, if you have, normally when you go on your record, you have an anticipated, you can have an anticipated end date. So if you think you're going to enroll all 50 of your subjects within a year, but then it looks like you've gotten 25 for whatever reason, and you're going to have to extend that, any kind of change in that, we need to be on ClinicalTrials.gov prior to that date that you have previously provided. Even if there are no changes, it does have to go through, similar to an IRB review, it has to have verification at least every 12 months. This is the requirement of the responsible party to confirm the accuracy of the record. There is a log within the PRS system that you can say, just doing annual check-in if you have absolutely nothing has changed. And then the records can be edited at any time using that modify button. And then again, you have to remember to re-release. So it is, a lot of times there have been mistakes where people have reviewed and approved, but haven't released it for PRS review. And so it may sit there for until you get nudged again to do it. So when do you have to report your results? So generally, for applicable clinical trials, they must be submitted by the responsible party no later than 12 months after the study completion date, which is the definition of that for applicable clinical trials is the date the final subject completed their participation or final collection of data. Again, this is when those tricky things that come up through the various organizations about what happens, especially with COVID, it became, sometimes you didn't know it was your final subjects. last date. So you just try to do it as best as possible. You have to upload one consent form, and it has to be after that final subject. So even if you submit it beforehand and think you're one and done, they do ask you that you submit after the final subject. So it's just one of their tricky rules. There are some extensions that can happen based off of if you have done your study, but it's been preliminary and you still need to do additional trials with that same product, or there is IP issues, et cetera, you can ask for delays for up to 2 additional years. And that gets to the most recent update that wasn't on that milestone slide way at the beginning. So it's just this year, really, it's been more implemented, is the good cause extension update. So there's always been a good cause extension. The change has been that bolded thing, so prior to the date. So in the past, if you thought you were going to have, say you ended your study a year ago from today, so you should have your results in today, but stuff happened and you didn't get it in, you should have applied for your good cause extension yesterday. You can't apply for it today. You can't apply for it tomorrow. Then you will be in non-compliance. So this is when I start to get into the violations part. So I have been threatening people with this for a decade or more. There is civil monetary penalties that came into place for applicable clinical trials that don't meet their current, they're not in compliance. So if it either failed to submit their clinical trial registration or their results in the time that they were supposed to do it, so that they didn't register it within 21 days of their first enrollment, they didn't provide the results a year after the last final subject, then there can be a penalty, as well as if you're submitting false or misleading information on the data bank. Now, this has been $10,000. It is $10,000 initial. The FDA will warn you. They'll give you a letter. You have 30 days to correct your record. If you don't, then that's when that penalty takes place, and then it will be an additional $10,000 until corrected. However, due to inflation, the current price, instead of $10,000, it's now $13,327. I don't know where they came up with that number, but that is the number that they have now provided. Now, that sounds very scary. And again, I have been warning people about this since 2009 when I got into research. However, it hasn't been happening. So it's been something that I've been threatening for a really long time. And until last year, really, was the first year that they finally sent one of these letters out. So they were not sending the letters, they were threatening it, people would be out of compliance, but it just wasn't being enforced. It has now been the attention, it's got media attention, it's been in Congress several times this year, in fact. So they are now starting to take it a little bit more seriously, and they have started to try to enforce these. Now, the ones that they've tried to enforce have met their corrections within the 30 days, so they weren't fined that $13,000. However, it's one of those things where we don't know when it's going to come or if it's going to come. So really trying to keep it compliant and follow the rules and the regulations as much as possible. There is confusion. There's confusion. Again, I meet on a task force monthly. We meet with PRS administrators, we meet with FDA, we meet with NIH, and we ask them some tough questions. And a lot of times it's, we'll get back to you, or we're not entirely sure. So it's a little frustrating, a little hard to follow regulations when the people that have them in place or are supposed to be enforcing them are not. But just to keep in mind that we try to do the best that we can. We try to do it not only to be fiscally responsible, but also ethically. So in conclusion, I just want to say, you know, our mission at Curling Clinic is to improve the health of that communities that we serve. And the best way to do that as investigators is to adhere to the regulations and the policies and ethical standards that are necessary to not only be successful in conducting our clinical trials, but to provide those results to everyone. So thank you for indulging me for this hour. I know it's leader meeting starting in a couple minutes. So if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them. If you have questions you want to take offline, here's my contact information, and I would be happy to reach out to you.
Kristina, that was excellent. I just have a general comment. Do you think people get in trouble when they think of this site as like social media site and they want to put something there because it's nice to have or to get more exposure for the trial, not knowing that there's just a lot of responsibility once you've created the entry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be a good, it's a good exposure, right? Like there's so many times if there's a study contact, perhaps like a medical student has left and then my information has been included as a study contact, just to have somebody that can be approached. I get some very interesting emails from people that all think that they can do the study brilliantly themselves or take it on. So I think there are some people that like to use it, of course, for publishing purposes or to just kind of get an idea of what other people are doing, but it does have a lot of stipulations that maybe they don't think of. All right, anything else?
We just have a couple thank yous, lots of great information. Great job in the chat.
All right. Well, thank you. I hope I don't come off as, I threaten you, but I'm obviously not very scary. So if you have any questions, no question is dumb. Again, this does trick up everybody and people much smarter and medically and scientifically savvy than me have probably had similar questions. So I can at least help guide you in the right direction if I don't know the answer. But thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristina. Great job.
Thank you.